For more than 30 years, one smile has been shorthand for Hollywood happiness itself. It sold romance. It sold hope. It convinced an entire generation that some people simply get to live charmed lives. Julia Roberts became the woman audiences turned to when they wanted to believe in good endings. But strip away the magazine covers and the box office numbers, and a very different story sits underneath, one built from loss stacked on loss, arriving again and again at moments when the world was watching her least. At 58, that story deserves to be told honestly, without the gloss. Julia Fiona Roberts was born on October 28, 1967, in Smyrna, Georgia. Her parents, Walter Grady Roberts and Betty Lou Brademus, were both drawn to the stage. Together they ran an acting workshop in Atlanta, a school that at one point brought them into contact with Coretta Scott King, who took classes there alongside her own children. It was, on paper, a household built entirely around creativity and expression. But the marriage did not last. Walter and Betty Lou divorced when Julia was only 4 years old, and the family that had seemed devoted to art and imagination fractured into something far less stable. Betty Lou remarried within the year, to a man younger than her by more than a decade. That second marriage would eventually end after over a decade, dissolved on grounds of cruelty. It also produced a daughter, Nancy, a half-sister whose life would later collide with Julia's in the most devastating way imaginable. Julia has kept her stepfather almost entirely out of any public conversation across her entire career. Whatever happened inside that house during those years, she has chosen never to describe it. That silence, sustained for decades in an industry that thrives on personal disclosure, says something on its own. Then came the loss that would follow her for the rest of her life. When Julia was 10 years old, her father died of throat cancer. He was 43. The man who had built an acting school from nothing, who had, whether he knew it or not, planted the earliest seed of his daughter's future career, was gone before she had left grade school. Grief that arrives at 10 years old doesn't behave like grief that arrives later. It doesn't announce itself. It settles into a person quietly and reshapes things from underneath, often for the rest of a life. By the late 1980s, something in Julia Roberts was impossible to look away from. She appeared in Mystic Pizza in 1988 and Steel Magnolias in 1989, and both films revealed a performer with an unusual gift, the ability to make an audience feel personally seen rather than simply entertained. Her performance in Steel Magnolias earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress before she had even turned 23. Then, in 1990, Pretty Woman detonated. A modest romantic comedy turned into the highest-grossing film of the year, pulling in more than $460 million worldwide against a $14 million budget. Within a single summer, Julia Roberts became the most recognizable actress alive. Every studio wanted her. Every magazine wanted her face. What had been a promising career became, almost overnight, a cultural phenomenon. The films that followed only deepened it. My Best Friend's Wedding in 1997, Notting Hill and Runaway Bride in 1999. Audiences kept coming back not because the stories were identical, but because something in the way she inhabited each role felt emotionally true in a way that was hard to name and impossible to fake. What almost none of that audience saw was what was happening away from the cameras. Fame of that scale arrived faster than any 20-something could reasonably be expected to absorb it, and the private cost of it was already accumulating before the public had any idea there was a cost at all. In 1990, Julia Roberts became engaged to actor Kiefer Sutherland. To the entertainment press, they were the era's golden couple, young, famous, seemingly inevitable. Invitations had gone out. Preparations were underway. And then, 3 days before the ceremony, Sutherland called it off. The humiliation wasn't quiet. It happened in full public view, covered by the same magazines that had spent months building the couple up as Hollywood royalty. Roberts later described the period afterward as one of the loneliest stretches of her life, not simply because of the heartbreak itself, but because she had to process it while cameras waited outside for a reaction she hadn't had time to have. It would be over a decade before she found something that felt durable. In 2002, she married cinematographer Danny Moder, a man she met working on a film set, someone with no appetite for the public performance that fame usually demands of a partner. The relationship that grew out of that marriage was deliberately kept away from the entertainment machine that had swallowed her earlier romantic life whole. Twins Hazel and Phineas arrived in 2004, and their son Henry followed in 2007. For over 2 decades, That marriage has functioned as the stable center of a life that has otherwise been anything but calm. But even a stable marriage could not shield her from what was coming next. Nothing in Julia Roberts' career prepared her, or could have prepared her, for February 2014. Her half-sister, Nancy Moats, was found dead in Los Angeles on February 9. She was 37. The cause was later determined to be a drug overdose, and she had left behind a suicide note. Nancy had worked as a production assistant on Glee and was engaged to be married at the time of her death. For years, she had lived in the shadow of a half-sister whose name opened doors in the industry that her own name never could. The relationship between the two women had grown strained long before that February, weighted down by years of complicated family history. The note made an already unbearable loss immeasurably worse. Nancy wrote that her mother and her famous siblings would inherit nothing from her death except the knowledge that they had driven her into the deepest despair of her life. She did not write this in the abstract. She named Julia specifically. There is a particular kind of pain in being blamed by name in a document meant to be a person's final words. It removes any possibility of distance or deniability. Whether that blame was fair, whether it reflected the genuine dynamics between the two women or the distortions that addiction and depression can impose on memory and perception, is not something anyone on the outside can resolve. What is certain is that those words existed, in writing, permanently, and Julia Roberts had no choice but to read them and then somehow keep living her life in public. 20 days after her sister's death, she sat for a previously scheduled interview with the Wall Street Journal. Those who were in the room described her visibly struggling to hold herself together, her voice catching as she tried to put words to something that had no adequate language. What she said, in essence, was that it was simply heartbreak, that only 20 days had passed, that there were no words sufficient to explain what the family had been through, and that she was getting through it hour by hour. Her mother, Betty Lou, moved in with Julia's family during that period, and the household drew inward around the shared grief. Those close to them at the time described the family as holding on to one another the way people cling together after a shipwreck. Julia Roberts had barely begun to find her footing again when 2015 took something else from her. Betty Lou Bredemus had been diagnosed with lung cancer in February 2013, a diagnosis that had unfolded quietly in the background even as Nancy's struggles intensified. Rather than move her mother into a care facility, Julia brought her into her own home in Malibu, where Betty Lou spent her final months surrounded by her daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren. On February 19, 2015, almost exactly 1 year after Nancy's death, and just 5 days before that year's Academy Award ceremony, Betty Lou died. She was 80 years old. Julia did not attend the Oscars that year. She couldn't. Losing a mother 12 months after losing a sibling to a suicide that named you directly is not the kind of grief that fits into any conventional timeline of mourning. The two losses didn't sit side by side, they compounded, each one making the other harder to carry. In the years since, she has occasionally offered small, quiet glimpses of that ongoing grief, a photograph shared around her mother's birthday, showing a bracelet engraved with a single word, Betty. No lengthy caption. No explanation. Just the fact of missing someone, stated as plainly as it can be stated. Even while carrying all of this, Julia Roberts kept building one of the most significant careers in modern Hollywood. In 2000, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance as real-life environmental advocate Erin Brockovich, a role that required her to abandon the romantic comedy warmth audiences associated with her and replace it with something rougher, more confrontational, more textured. Critics praised the completeness of that transformation. Audiences responded too. The film earned more than $250 million worldwide. That same year, she became the first woman in film history to command a $20 million per picture salary, a milestone that mattered far beyond her own bank account. It reset what studios believed a female star's earning power could be, in an industry that had spent decades structuring compensation almost exclusively around male leads. The films that followed showed an actress deliberately testing her own range. Ocean's 11 in 2001 put her inside an ensemble of major male stars without needing to compete for the frame. Closer in 2004 asked her to play someone morally messier than anything the Pretty Woman audience had ever seen from her. Duplicity in 2009 demonstrated a sharper, more technical command of a genre she hadn't worked in before. None of these were the choices of someone coasting on recognizability. They were the choices of someone who understood exactly what she'd built and wanted to see what else it could hold. Not every choice landed the way the industry expected. There were stretches where trade publications openly speculated about whether her box office pull had faded, whether the era she defined was quietly closing. She answered that speculation the only way she ever had, by choosing work that interested her rather than work that was safe, refusing the pressure to keep performing the same version of herself that had made her famous at 22. Julia Roberts turned 58 in October 2025. She has now been married to Danny Moder for more than 2 decades. Her twins, Hazel and Phineas, are adults in their early 20s. Her son Henry is a teenager. The life she has built around that family looks almost deliberately unremarkable next to the career that surrounds it. She has spoken in interviews about the specific relief of ordinary things, cooking, reading, simply existing somewhere that doesn't require the awareness of being watched. The grief hasn't gone anywhere. The father lost at 10. The half-sister whose final written words placed the blame on her by name. The mother who died almost exactly a year later, after months spent living inside the same house, carrying the same unbearable weight, before the cancer finished what it had started. None of that stops belonging to a person simply because public attention moves on to something else. What has shifted, over the years since, is the way she carries it. The interviews given in the raw aftermath of 2014 and 2015 were marked by a rawness that hadn't had time to settle into anything. Now, more than a decade on, what surfaces publicly is quieter: a bracelet with a name engraved on it, a caption that offers nothing more than the plain fact of absence. That quietness isn't the same thing as having moved past it. It's what grief looks like once a person has lived alongside it long enough that it no longer needs elaborate language to be understood. Her 3 children were young when Betty Lou died, old enough to understand illness, old enough to feel the particular weight of watching a parent grieve inside their own home. Roberts has described her mother as the person who taught her everything she came to understand about motherhood itself, a woman who raised 3 children largely on her own without ever performing the difficulty of it, someone whose dry humor and refusal to dramatize hardship shaped the way Roberts has spoken about her own family in the years since. There's a reason the phrase, "America's sweetheart," has stayed attached to Julia Roberts for over 3 decades, long after most of her peers from that era faded from that kind of cultural shorthand. It was never only the smile. It was the way that smile always seemed to carry something else alongside it, an awareness that life is difficult, and a decision, made repeatedly, to keep showing up anyway. The lightness people responded to was never naive. It was chosen, over and over, often in the exact moments when choosing it would have been hardest. The tragedy in Julia Roberts' story isn't a single scandal or a single headline. It's cumulative: a childhood shaped by a fractured home and an early death, a public humiliation survived and rebuilt from, a suicide note that named her directly, and a mother lost 12 months later while the wound from the first loss was still completely open. None of it was visible to the audiences who simply watched the films and saw only what the fame allowed them to see. She lost her father before she was old enough to fully understand what that loss would mean for the rest of her life. She survived a public collapse of a relationship that could have defined her differently than it did. She read words from a woman she couldn't save, words that held her personally responsible for a pain she may never have fully understood the depths of. She lost her mother the year after that, in the same house, having tried everything she could to make those final months gentler. And she kept working. She kept earning a place at the very top of an industry that rarely offers women that kind of longevity, becoming one of the defining actresses of 2 separate decades rather than one. At 58, there's no tidy way to summarize what Julia Roberts has lived through. It isn't a fairy tale, and it isn't a tragedy packaged for easy consumption either. It's simply a life, complicated, shaped by things no amount of money or fame could have prevented, carried forward by someone who has kept, through all of it, that same unmistakable quality of attention in her eyes that stopped audiences cold when she was 22 years old and just getting started.